more about China-EU relations. So before we were cut off there, Professor Jiang, you were talking to us about how China and the EU can better manage their differences and focus a bit more on their common interests. So if you could expand on that a little bit more for us.
Yes. I think both sides should continue to push forward the people-to-people exchanges. And also, don't forget the U.S. effect. As we have seen that the U.S. effect has been a kind of obstacle for China-EU relationship. And finally, I would argue that trade and investment relationship is always the engine for China-EU relationship. So if we can do all of these things, we can strengthen our mutual trust, and then can we narrow down our differences. Of course, finally, I would say mutual trust is a two-way street. Both sides should do what it should do.
Well, Professor Jiang, when it came to trade and market access, the EU side spoke about reciprocity and achieving a level playing field. But China is still a developing country, of course, with already significant market access for its very own stage of development. So why do advanced economies like the EU and the US always want to see this level playing field with developing countries? Is that fair in itself?
Well, this kind of issue, I would say it's like old wine in the old bottle. I've been hearing this kind of talk for so many years. Well, don't forget that China is still a developing country. Don't say that China can launch the Beidou navigation satellite this morning so that China is not a developing country. Don't believe that China is now the second biggest economy, so it's not a developing country. China is, after all, is still a developing country. We have 600 million people whose monthly income is around 150 euros. So how can you say China is a developed country? And of course, China and anybody in the world should follow the rules, the so-called level playing field. But don't blame China for everything. You know, when China opened its door many years ago, China wanted to attract all kinds of investment. And now China wants to choose some kind of investment which best fit its economic needs. So you cannot say this kind of choice is not level playing field.
Right. Well, in terms of common interests, Professor Jiang, there was a substantive discussion on climate change. That, of course, is an area where the two sides could agree on. How big are the economic and global implications of increasing synergies in climate and the environment between China and the EU, you think?
Well, first of all, I must point out that both the EU and China are the two important vanguards in the so-called climate change, in the so-called green field, the so-called green development. But if you want to push forward towards a better future in this field, I think China and EU can do the following things. First of all, both sides should make efforts to exchange sophisticated technology. Because if you want to push forward the green development, technology is very important. Secondly, I would suggest both sides can set up a kind of a joint fund. Okay, so without money, without capital, you cannot do anything at all about this kind of thing. And finally, both sides should join hands to fight against unilateralism, because the US is against the Paris Climate Change Agreement.
And finally, Professor Jiang, both sides underscore the need to jointly drive a global recovery from the pandemic. How can both sides better coordinate on that front?
Well, I'm not sure if you can recall that in the year 2007 and 2008, people say China saved the world from the international financial tsunami. And then in 2009 and 2008, when the EU was caught in the debt crisis, people say China saved Europe. But now, well, we do not often hear people say that China will save the world from the pandemic. But I would say China can make some contributions to the world economic recovery after the pandemic era. First of all, I will say China and the EU can push forward the so-called e-business, okay, so that we can strengthen our bilateral trade relationship. And secondly, we must fight against trade protectionism, okay. Third, China and the EU should finish the negotiation of their bilateral investment treaty. This kind of treaty will benefit the EU, will benefit China, and also benefit the world economy. And finally, don't forget the Belt Road, okay? The Belt Road is good for the world economic recovery. So after the pandemic, China and the EU should join hands to push forward the Belt Road one big step forward.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks for your thoughts on this, Professor Jiang Shixue from Shanghai University.